Hopefully you
Can you
can
hear
hear
me?
me. Let's just think about this. Clearly there are some technical things, but there are also some non-technical things. So it doesn't really matter which one you think about, but in terms of technical things, and let me just give you a clue. If I go back and I show you that picture again, if I show you that picture, we're talking about roads and tunnels and bridges, etc. What do you think might be one of the technical issues that was a problem that could have been, should have been, more carefully addressed at the early stages of the project? Okay, thinking about that.
I think is roads is too complicated.
The roads are too complicated. The road system is complex. It's quite a compact city centre. So to take a main roadway all the way through is challenging because you have a lot of buildings that if you're going to tunnel and you're going to build roadways next to, their integrity needs to be maintained. So you have to be very careful in the way in which you go about conducting it. So yes, I would agree with you to some extent, but it wasn't the one that I was specifically thinking about when I showed you that picture just now. So if I go back to the picture again, it's got to do with this, the harbour, okay? The minute, if we look at the city, the main part of the city is really around here. This is the downtown part of the city, around the centre slightly to the left of the middle. So this is the main downtown part, but the harbour presents a particular challenge. The challenge is that when you look at the city, a lot of that area around the harbour is built on reclaimed land. And the minute you want to start digging tunnels and building and doing sorts of heavy civil engineering work on land that has been reclaimed from the sea, from the water, it presents a lot of complex technical problems. If you speak to any civil engineer or geotechnical engineer, structural engineers, they will all tell you that that is a very, very challenging environment. The thing about this project, it was to some extent a little bit of what you might call a vanity project. In other words, the politicians in the city were very, very, very sure that they wanted this project to go ahead. And it's true of the next one as well that I'm going to show you. And the political drive to make things happen sometimes gets in the way of the technical understanding and appreciation of what's needed to make a project happen. It happens in companies. You might have a CEO or a chief engineer who wants to drive through a technical project. They're really passionate about it. But if they haven't necessarily done all their homework properly and they don't understand some of the pitfalls that might occur, some of the technologies that they want to include, they may not necessarily have appreciated, they're not as mature as they thought they were, then you get to the situation where you can set a project off running away quite happily, have a budget, have a time, and then it's just one thing after another because the things that need to be in place aren't as easy to put in place as you first thought. And this is very true with this particular project. The politicians and the people in the city who were making decisions really believed in it. They knew the city needed it. They wanted it to happen. but the technical complexity was far, far greater. They completely underestimated it. And to some extent, the same things happened in Liverpool in the UK. When Liverpool was going to prepare itself to become the European City of Culture, they did a similar sort of project, and that was overspent and took longer. In fact, in this case, I say it took longer. Some parts of the project were just removed because they couldn't afford it in the time that they had. And in London at the moment, one of the big civil engineering projects, I think it's one of the biggest civil engineering projects in Europe at the moment, is the building of the Crossrail line, which is a railway line across from one side of London to the other, from west to east. And that Crossrail, well, it's well over budget, and it's well behind, and it's just encountered problem after problem after problem. Again, due to complexity, but also other things have cropped up there. Things like when you go through the middle of a city as old as London, you start to find archaeological sites. And in many parts of the world, when you hit an archaeological site, everything has to stop until the archaeologists have been brought in and they've done their work, and it's decided as to whether or not the site needs to be preserved or not. So that sort of thing is another thing that can be causing endless delays and overspends. And if we go back to the Big Dig, things haven't been easy with that particular project. There have been problems. This particular incident that occurred in 2006, where some of the panelling on the side actually came crashing down, and there were fatalities as a consequence of this. So the project has not been without its problems even once it was completed. The other project that I wanted to share with you is very much smaller in scale, and it's around a building. It was the building for the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh in the UK. It's a very unusual building. Some people like it, some people hate it. But this particular project was very, very similar in terms of the fact that the complexity and the way in which the complexity and the choices about the project were managed as the project unfolded meant that the project ended up overspending and taking longer to complete than it was originally planned. You can see here the final cost was £431 million, which is 10 times the initial budget, and it was 3 years behind schedule. This was, it was considered quite a special building. At the end of the day, that overspend required an inquiry to be conducted, and that was conducted. And there's a lot of text on this slide, but the basic idea was that at the end of the day, the way in which the project had been set up and the way in which changes were managed as people had ideas and thought, oh, we'll add this in, oh, we'll add that in. How that was managed was not very good, and the cost just kept going up and up and up. So another really good example of a project that was not set up properly at the very beginning. So the problem for us as project managers is that we've got nowhere to hide. Once the project starts up, we have to continue to move the project forward as best we can, and we have to account for the decisions and the things that happen during the course of the project. The project manager is exposed the whole time. They can't hide away. So who better to go to for some really wise advice than Winnie the Pooh, who's obviously a very, very popular and familiar character from literature, certainly here in the UK. And this little, this is taken from a project management textbook, actually. This particular use of the word success, you can see vertically down the side of the screen, tries to capture what you think are the key issues that need to be considered right at the very outset to have a good definition for your project. So there has to be some aspiration. So you have a dream. But that dream then has to be rooted in reality. So from that dream, you have to have a clear, explicit goal. To make that happen, you have to have a plan. You have to have resources, whether that be money, whether that be people, whether that be equipment, whatever it is. You need to most probably enhance the skills and abilities of the people that are going to be working on the project as the project unfolds. And we talked about that before, if you remember, when we were talking about the Airbus scenario last time. We talked about one of the things that caused the overspends and the problems there was that the managers, the project managers, didn't appreciate the skills that were needed. So they underestimated some of that complexity and didn't staff up accordingly. You've then got to spend the time wisely, because a plan is not just about what you're going to do, it's also against a timeline. And then you get organised and off you go. And if you've got all those things in place, then perhaps you'll have a much, much better chance of success. In a lot of organisations today, they try to integrate this all together, and they use something that's called the work breakdown structure. And that's what I'm going to ask you is to create that. Okay? And in the work breakdown structure, what we're trying to do is identify and understand what we need to do. Okay? What we need to do in the project. So, at that point, anybody got any questions? We'll be quite happy with all of this, because what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the steps that are related to defining the scope of the project. Any questions from anyone? No? Okay, if there's no questions, I'll carry on going. So, in terms of defining the scope for the project, objectives, we have what we call deliverables, which are things that we need to deliver to our customer. We have milestones, which are the points at which we have to deliver those deliverables. We need the technical requirements. We need any constraints, what we call limits and exclusions. These are constraints and things that we need to make sure that, although we're not going to do them, we need to make sure we know where the boundaries are, where the streams are. And then we need to consider reviewing with our customer and our project team. Okay? If we don't have all those things in place, then we're more than likely going to fail. And it's really, really worth spending the time right at the very beginning to make it happen. This is called the iron triangle. It's the basis of all good project management. What it says is, in order to deliver a quality project, which is the center of the triangle, you need to consider the scope. So that's your specification. You need to consider how much it's going to cost you to do it and the time it's going to take you to do it. If any of those three circles is missing, the quality will be compromised and you may well not have a successful project. So that's why it's called the iron triangle. And when you're thinking about priorities, it's often helpful to produce a little matrix like this. What we've got across the top, we've got time, performance and cost, which are the three elements of the iron triangle. And down the side, we've got constrain, enhance and accept. And what we mean by that is, if it's constrained, it means it can't be compromised under any circumstances. It has to stay, it's a given. If we have enhance, it means it would be good if we could do better in that area. And if we have accept, it means, okay, if we have to accept a slight variation or increase, then that's okay. It's a little bit more flexible. So where you can see the 3 dots on this particular graphic, and they could be in any of the 9 boxes. It's up, each individual project will be differently. What this is telling us is that the specification for this, the performance, is absolutely, it must be achieved. There's no compromise allowed. The enhance on time means we'd like to do it a little bit quicker if it's at all possible. So if we could reduce the time, that would be really, really beneficial. And the accept with cost is saying, okay, if we're not going to compromise on the performance and we're going to try and do it a bit quicker, if we have to spend a little bit more money, that's okay. Okay, so there's a balance between those 3 priorities. As I say, those dots could be in any of those 9 boxes. So you can imagine different projects might have different features. So it's a useful little tool. It's very, very visual. So when you're talking to your project team, you can have this sort of thing in place and they'll be able to see what the priorities are for the project. Now to the work breakdown structure. What the work breakdown structure is, it's about taking a project and breaking it down into smaller and smaller elements. And it is the basis for a good project plan, because what you're going to do is you're going to transfer the information you've created on your work breakdown structure into the plan for the project. So sometimes we refer to it as a map of the project. It's a way to include people, because in going through the process of creating the work breakdown structure, you're going to most probably be reaching out to the people who are actually going to be doing some of the work. So it's a way to include them in the decision-making process. And it also helps us to, when we put figures on it, track the costs. So how much it's going to cost us to do each of the different elements. So if we look at the hierarchy within a project, we have the project at the top here. So the complete project, that's what it's going to come to. We can then break it down, and depending on the complexity of the project, there might be all of these layers or only a subset of these layers. Depending, if it's a much simpler project, you may only need to go down to 1 or 2 layers. So we've got the project, we've got deliverables, sub-deliverables, we've got then another form of sub-deliverable, and then that can go into what we call cost accounts, and finally work packages. And work packages are the actual package of work that an individual or possibly an organisation are going to be charged to do. And that is effectively the smallest element of the project. So the benefits of the work breakdown structure: defines everything, responsibilities, who's going to do it. You can put time and resources to it. It helps with the planning. And it's very much, and this is really important, it's very much output oriented. So it's very much about what is going to be produced as a consequence of the project taking place. So this is an example of a project, and this particular project is to produce a new prototype of a personal computer. Now, it's not got every element on it, it's just got some elements, just to show you how this particular structure works. So the top level is the completed prototype. As you then move down to the next level, you've got higher level deliverables, things that will go together to make the prototype, but they are still most probably made up of multiple elements. So in this particular example, you can see the disk storage units. Now, we've got 3 types here: hard, optical, floppy. Okay. If we take this down to the next level, we can then see the other elements that might be needed to make the hard disk come about. And then ultimately we've got the work packages at the bottom. So what we've got here is at the very bottom, the different work elements that are ultimately going to make the things on the next level up, that will then make the next level up, and all the way up to the very top where you've got a prototype of a personal computer. So all of these different elements will be identified for each of the items on the level 2 here. Now, should you say one thing here, you'll notice that the top level here, the personal computer prototype, is labelled as level 1. In some organisations, this is identified as level 0. So sometimes it's as here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the side. In some organisations and in some work breakdown structures, you might see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? Don't be put off by the 0, 1. There's no difference at all. It's just a different way of representing it. So, the next step is once you've produced that work breakdown structure that you've seen there, and you've got all the different elements mapped out onto a computer screen or a piece of paper, however you're going to do it, then you need to integrate that work breakdown structure with the organisation. Now, that can be a little bit difficult at times. It creates something called the organisation breakdown structure, but what it does is it brings the actual work elements and the people who are going to do it together into one structure, and this is what it might look like. So you've got exactly the same work breakdown structure you had beforehand, but now what you'll notice is in the bottom left hand corner you've got the organisation. So you've got the different departments and the people that will be doing the work, and where they map against the different work packages, you will see the words cost account in there, because what will then be done is the work packages will be identified against a team or an individual in a team in the organisation, and they will create a cost account for that. So an amount of money that that person is able to spend, including their costs of labour, for that particular piece of work. So you're getting down to some pretty granular detail here. But when it comes to managing the project from the point of view of the plan and the time at which these different elements are going to be carried out, and the way in which you control the money side of things, this is absolutely fundamental. Can't get away from that. That's then got to be put into some sort of IT system. So what happens then is we code all of the items on the work breakdown structure such that they can then go into that IT system. You will have noticed on this particular graphic here, you'll notice that there's these little numbers start to occur, 1.2, 1.3, 1.1, all of these different elements, and then it goes down 1.1.1. These are the unique identifiers that are going to be used in the IT system to help control the project. And then everything is rolled up. So if we go back to here, once you've done all this granular work at the bottom of this graphic, then that all sort of rolls up all the way up to the top, and you get an overall budget, and an overall plan can then be developed for the production of whatever the item is that's in that top box. So you've got all the detail you need to do a really good definition of the project. That roll-up will also identify the bottom point on this particular slide here, where you have conflicts between different resources. It might be that in producing the project, you've got lots and lots of reliance on one particular team within the organisation or one particular subcontractor. And when you produce that rolled up picture of the project, you'll then start to see where those conflicts are, and that'll help you resolve them before you even start spending any real money on the project. So this is what it'll end up looking like. This is just, again, a little subset of that previous graphic about the work breakdown structure. What you'll do is those cost accounts, you'll start allocating money. So you'll have an overall budget for each of the different elements there, and then you can roll those all up to get an overall cost at the top for what that's going to be. And that's really, really important. Now, I'm going to go back a couple of slides just quickly to this one here. You'll notice that in this work breakdown structure, because the overall product that we're trying to produce is something hard, it's something tangible, it's fairly self-explanatory here in terms of breaking it all down into different elements of hardware or software that will end up being needed to produce the final product. Now, what sometimes happens is when you produce a work breakdown structure, sometimes some of these elements here, it's perhaps more difficult to think about them in terms of tangible product things, and you often might be considering things that are more perhaps process in terms of the boxes on the work breakdown structure. It depends on the project, but what I would say is always try and have something that's tangible, such as this, the process being implicit within those tangible elements. But if you do find yourself going off down a process pathway, then make sure that everything is process rather than having a mix of tangible product things and process things. Okay? And you might find that in the task that I'm going to ask you to do for next time, you might find that you have that sort of dilemma, and it might actually be something you have to think about quite carefully. That's where this comes in, the process breakdown structure. It's equivalent to a work breakdown structure, but it's where projects are perhaps more driven by process rather than the production of a product. So they need to be organized around the different phases, but you need to be consistent. Don't mix the two, because it starts to become really challenging and not very intuitive when you start to look at them. Another tool that you can use to help you to bring all of this together is, once you've identified all the different tasks that you might need as part of the project, you can then start to identify the responsibilities for the different members of the team. And you can see here, there are people who are responsible for different elements of work, and those people who are supporting them in various different ways. So you start to then build up a picture of the resources that you might need within your team, within your organization, within your whoever it is that you're considering as your base unit, that are going to work on the different elements that go to make up the project. Now, a question for you. There are two words that are really important here. Once you've been through the process of creating your work breakdown structure and you've created your overall project budget based on all that detail you've created, there are two things you need to consider before you settle on the final amount of money that you're going to allocate to this particular project. And it's wrapped up with these two terms here. There might also be profitability. So for instance, if you decide when you've done your work breakdown structure, say it comes to £1,000, you might decide that you want to make 10% profit on that. So you're going to make it £1,100 as the overall cost of the project to the customer. But that's very simplistic. There are two other things you need to consider as well. And these are what are called the contingency and the reserve. Now, does anybody have any idea what the contingency and the reserve might be? So what is the difference between the contingency and the reserve? They are an amount of money. They need to be added into the cost of the project. So if, as I just said there, it's £1,000 for the project, we're adding 10% because that's what we want for profit. Before we do that, we need to consider the contingency and the reserve. So what are they, the contingency and the reserve? I'm just waiting for the typing to finish. Oh. Yeah, contingency is something that can happen. You're sort of on the right lines. The contingency and the reserve are both amounts of money, and what they're there for is they're there because we appreciate that in most projects it's very difficult to specify everything accurately right at the very beginning. So we were talking about definition today. You can be very, very loose with that definition, and then you get projects like the Big Dig and the Scottish Parliament where they were very, very loose, they didn't think about it, and they overran by large amounts. Now let's assume that we're not doing that. Let's assume that we're doing a better job than that. We're being quite rigorous with the way in which we set the project up, we define it. There's still a possibility that things might not be specified as explicitly as we would have liked, or as it would be necessary to have no errors or problems at all. And the contingency and the reserve are amounts of money that are put aside to try and help us should we get into that difficulty. And there's a very clear difference between the two, and it's very simple. The contingency is within the control of the project manager. So the project manager will know there is a contingency of X amount of pounds, and they will be able to access that should they have good reason to access it because something unexpected has happened during the course of the project. The reserve is an amount of money that is set aside that is not within the control of the project manager, and the project manager has to go and get higher level approval to be able to use the money in the reserve. So there are two different bits of funding, both to do with the safety and completion of the project, but one is within the grasp of the project manager and one isn't. So for instance, if we said we'll have a contingency that is say 10% of the cost of the project when we've done the work breakdown structure and the roll up, okay? And we had a similar amount, 10% of the cost of the original cost of the project for the reserve. So say then it was £1,000 for the project. We have £1,000 plus 100 plus 100, and then we'll put the profit on top of that, 10% of the overall amount. So in that case, it would be 1,200, so it'd be 10%. So the overall cost of the project would be £1,200, £1,320. So we've got there the 1,000, the 100, the 100, and the 120. The thing is It's just the 100 that is able to be used by the project manager without any additional approval. So it's really, really important, because projects do have difficulties, and it's important that we take account of that when we're putting the budget together. Often, having gone through all of that work, the final step would be to produce a business case to get final approval. So you've produced your work breakdown structure, you've done your budget, you've put in your contingency and reserve, you've most probably produced a timeline for the project. So then you're going to build a business case. The business case needs to basically lay out what the project is about, what's going to be done and why. So you've got your specification in there. There needs to be that justification, and you need to then present that to whoever is going to give the final approval for the project. It may be within a company, it may be to a customer. And this is the point for negotiation, because all that work that you've done beforehand is fine. You can make changes. You haven't really spent a huge amount of money other than go through the definition part of the project. So this is where the discussions and the debate need to take place if you're going to start the project off on the right foot. So that's all I wanted to cover today. That's everything about how to set up the project. The next sessions are going to start to get into some of the detail as to how we go about setting some of the tools in place to enable us to run the project effectively. So we'll take a little look at that next week, and we'll make sure next week that the class will run for the hour and a half next week. It's just this week because of the change, and I'd forgotten the change to British summertime. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to do a little work breakdown structure for next time, just to check that you're happy with this particular tool, because it is a really fundamental tool for project management. One of the good ways to create a work breakdown structure is to use post-it notes, little sticky notes, because what you can do then is you can start to lay it out on a tabletop or on a wall, whatever you feel like, and you can move things around until you're finally happy that you've got the right sort of work breakdown structure. Okay, so I suggest you try and do that rather than just try and write it down straight away or try and produce it electronically in a Word document or a PowerPoint slide. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to capture what you do, and you don't have to do it as individuals, you can do it as pairs, little groups, doesn't matter. And if you could send it to me as a Word document or a PowerPoint slide, then I can incorporate it into the presentation for next week, and we can talk about some of the examples that you've put forward. Don't be worried, you're not going to get it right first time. The development will require different cycles, so it will be iterative. So don't try and think you're going to get it right first time, because that won't work. If you can send it to me by the end of Sunday next week, that would be really, really helpful, because then that'll give me time to put the presentation together for Monday. Also for next week, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take a look at a very, very short case study that I've sent you, Capital Industries. It's only 2 pages. Just want you to read it because we'll have a little chat about that. And I'd like you to read the notes for classes 4 and 5, because again, I'm not going to go through them particularly carefully. I'm just going to move through them fairly quickly, such that you've got the basic ideas of 4 and 5. I'll assume that you've read them and you understand them. If you've got any questions about 4 and 5, then let me know, because we'll. I guess most of them, I think you'll be better off just trying to do some examples, which we'll do the week after. What is the work breakdown structure? Right, very simply, I want you to consider what's needed for the design, build and equipping of a brand new laboratory. It can be an IT lab, it can be a chemistry lab, it can be a mechanical lab. I really don't care what the lab is. So develop some ideas either on your own as a group. Think about what sort of lab it is. Think logically. Don't assume anything. If you want to think about different ideas, make sure you write them all down. At the end, does your work breakdown structure make sense is a really important question to ask yourself. And then this idea is whether it's based on product or process. And think about, could it be better? Now, I think if you take the lab as the top level, I think you should most probably only need to go down a couple of levels just to demonstrate that you understand how the work breakdown structure works. So if you take the numbering that we had in the slide, 1, 2, 3 should be enough for you to participate in doing this exercise appropriately. And if you are having a spot of bother and you're not quite sure what the work breakdown structure is, there's a little video here on this link at the bottom of the screen, WBS work breakdown structure. If you click on that, then that will take you to a place where you can see a little video on how to put a work breakdown structure together. Okay, so that's it for today. We've been through project definition. We've looked at the different stages. The fundamental part of it is the work breakdown structure that then enables us to create a budget. And the task for next week, a couple of tasks to do the work breakdown structure for that exercise I've just showed you, and then a little bit of reading with the case study and the notes for classes 4 and 5. And we'll do classes 4 and 5 next week. I did send you another paper as well, which I thought was quite interesting. It's not particularly up to date, but it's a good little paper that talks about the challenges of IT projects. Take a read of it if you get a chance, and I'm just interested to know whether you agree or disagree with the author of that particular paper. If you were to write a paper today, would you capture some of the same ideas based on your experience, or would there be different things that you'd be writing about in a paper such as that? Okay, anybody got any questions before we finish for today? Next week, hopefully please come along. A lot more of you talking and participating. I'd like to hear your thoughts on your work breakdown structures and on the case study that we're going to discuss next week.
Professor Clark, I have a question.
Yes.
So if I right understand you, we should make a breakdown structure. It should be as a table or just a scheme or just or text, or text we should send you by the mail, or like that one.
What I'm looking for is a structure something like this, the slide that I've got on the screen. So if where the top box has got personal computer prototype, if you put in there new IT laboratory, and then what would then be the next elements that would go together on the next layer down to make that new IT laboratory, and then perhaps go down one more layer, so there's another layer of detail. Don't worry about putting any amounts of money or anything. I'm just interested in what you consider to be the tasks that would need to be involved and or the deliverables that would need to be produced to enable you to create that laboratory. I just want you to have a go at the first 3 levels of producing a work breakdown structure for the scenario I've given you. And if you could either do that drawing as a PowerPoint slide or do it as in a Word document, however you feel, or if you want to do it in an Excel, whatever it is, and capture that and send that to me, then I'll incorporate it into the presentation for next week. Is that okay?
Yes, so we should do the picture like this and some description to that and send you by the email.
That would be great. Yes, thank you. That way we can look at what everybody's done and we can see what the differences are. And that's where the learning comes in, because if we look at the differences, how different people have attacked it, then we can see what the different options might have been. Okay, any more questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, then I'm going to say goodbye for today. We'll see you again next week. Look forward to seeing what you come up with your work breakdown structures, and hopefully we can have a good discussion next week that will be helpful for everyone. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Take care.